You are listening to the Hiking Radio Network, where we talk the walk with shows by hikers, about hikers, for everybody.
Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, the ultimate midlife crisis. Join Steve and his guests every week as he staggers from Georgia to Maine.
Hey guys, thanks for coming back to the podcast. This is episode 402 of the show. And in case you don't know, you're listening to Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, the ultimate midlife crisis. I'm Steve Adams on Mighty Blue, and this week we're going to be heading across the pond to my old home, the UK. Now, many of you know that I hiked the West Highland Way in Scotland last year, and I plan to hike the 630-mile Southwest Coast Path next year. Well, Dan Klaiber, whose original interest was in a PCT thru-hike, well, Dan just upped the game for all Brits wanting to see their most beautiful trails. I'm not going to steal Dan's thunder, but let's just say that he's making me think long and hard about what he's just done. We're going to hear from Dan in a moment. Then, with Jessica coming up on 9 months on the AT this year, we catch up with her again as she approaches Pennsylvania. And as several of our Mighty Blue class of 2023 have experienced, our listeners have been reaching out to help her achieve her dream of a thru-hike. Jessica will be along after Dan, followed by Then the Hail Came by George Stefanos. This week, George gets his first sighting of Katahdin. For those of us who have experienced that moment, we know exactly how he felt. So let's get on and meet Dan Klaiber, or Rockhopper. Our guest today is a fellow Brit, and unfortunately we haven't got subtitles for you. He's Dan Klaiber, and I promise you, he's got quite a story that proves the serendipity of thru-hiking that all of us feel when we're out there. Hey Dan, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hi, it's an absolute welcome.
And yours is I think, and the more I looked at it, it's a multi-layered story that's going to unfold as we move through it. But first, let's hear a little bit about you. What was the long-distance trail that first attracted you to the idea of long-distance hiking?
I think for me, I grew up very much involved in competitive cross-country athletics. And I think as sort of time went on and my competitive days started to sort of become less frequent, the transition into thru-hiking for me felt like a natural process.
Really?
And I think for me, well, getting into running in the first place was very much a case of it was a natural talent. It was something that I was good at, and it evolved from there.
Did you do a lot of competitive races in?
I did, yeah. I competed for my county. I was county champion for nice. A number of years, cross-country athletics, represented my university, which was all fantastic. But I think one part of competing that I didn't necessarily enjoy was the pressure, mostly from myself. I'm always putting myself under pressure to perform
isn't
well.
It always, yeah.
Yeah, and I think because I started from quite a young age and there was always this expectation that I would do well from others, I carried that pressure through with me. So there was always this pressure on me. But then when I transitioned into thru-hiking, I could utilize the same skills, the same traits that I use whilst running,
sure.
But it was much more leisurely, it was much more enjoyable. But at the same time, I could still engage with that element of competitiveness, but it was on a completely personal level. So whilst I always enjoyed the more leisurely side of thru-hiking, I'm always sort of pushing myself to do longer distances, to do high mileage days, but without pushing it too far, because at the end of the day, hiking is about enjoying the environment and enjoying the experience. So it was finding that right balance between, pushing myself and the competitive spirit of thru-hiking, but just making sure that I was always enjoying the process.
Yeah, but there was one particular trail that attracted you, I know, and you started working towards it, and it wasn't the AT, was it? So tell us about the trail you were looking to do.
So this all started from the Pacific Crest Trail. Like so many thru-hikers, they aspire to hike these long trails, and the PCT for me was the epitome of what I wanted to do. And when I discovered the PCT, I was still in the midst of my education and training to become a qualified architect. So I just started my master's degree in Sheffield, and I think at that time I just come out of a long 5-year relationship, and going through that transition, leaving the relationship, going into university.
Sure.
It was a very difficult stage of my life, but that opportunity, and I'll call it an opportunity because it created a void in my life, I should say, and that allowed me to really reevaluate where I wanted to go from that point.
Sure.
Yeah, and then so the PCT became something that I really wanted to do, and so for the next 5-6 years throughout my education, because the plan was always to go and complete the PCT once I qualified.
Right.
I hadn't done any travelling prior to that, so that was my gap year, as it were.
Oh, right. Okay.
And then so my qualification exams were scheduled. I was working towards the end of my exams, and then spring 2020.
Alarm bells.
Yeah, we all know what happened there. So the PCT was scheduled for 2020. They had my permits. I planned to the extent that all my gear was pretty much purchased. All the planning was done to the extent that you can plan on
Sure.
a hike like the PCT. Sure. But yeah, with 2020 and the difficulty that's presented, I had to cancel my plans for.
And did you have to because you were foreign? You couldn't fly over there because of COVID, or was it because you chose, or because people weren't? Not so many people were hiking the PCT.
It was more the logistical side of things.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I'm sure the ethical side of things would have come in had it been logistically possible. But for me, I hadn't obtained my visa by that point.
Oh, right.
Because the interviews were repeatedly being cancelled, so there was no chance of that happening.
Yeah.
And also, travel, air travel was just not happening at all. It was all shut down.
Life's often about timing, as once again we're going to find out in a minute. And as our listeners are going to hear, you're a real detail-oriented guy, aren't you? Tell us about your preparation for the PCT, because it seems to me you did a heck of a lot of prep for it, in the UK. So what did you actually do?
So in terms of preparing for the PCT, I mean, I'm very lucky being here in the UK that there's a whole vast landscape of absolutely incredibly beautiful trails. Yeah. So it really started in 2018. That's when I got my teeth into the long distance trails around me. And that started with the Cotswold Way.
Right.
But that was that first trail didn't actually go to plan. Being the age I was, sort of mid-20s, you feel as though you're invincible. And
of course, yeah. I'm 70, I still feel invincible.
And I made the very rookie mistake of attempting a 100-mile hike in sort of 3 days, which at the time, was something that I thought I could do easily. But yeah, I got to mile 68 and injured my IT band in my left leg. And that's.
Is there something funny enough? Does that show a difference between long distance hiking and cross country running? Because I know one of the big things for most people, starting too fast and trying to do too many miles at the beginning is always a mistake as a thru hiker.
Yes.
But as a runner, you can pretty run, not full out, but you can run pretty long distances, can't you?
Yes, that's true. I think I've always been used to pushing myself from the very first meter. So yeah, it was a shock to have gone sort of through that process, but it set me back physically for a good year and a half.
Wow, really? That bad? Blimey.
Yeah. It was pretty bad. But I mean, for the sort of, I would say probably about a year, and then it just took a few more months just to fully get back to full working order. But at the time, it was the worst thing that could have happened, because I had ambitions of doing the PCT and doing longer trails after that, and suddenly I've got this injury and it's keeping me out for several months. Right. But looking back now, knowing what I've completed to date, it was actually a blessing in disguise, because it taught me very harsh lessons, and I had to essentially go back to the drawing board. Understand.
It's humbling. It's humbling, isn't it?
It is humbling, yeah, absolutely.
Nothing wrong with that, by the way, as well.
No.
Was it the preparation that you enjoy, or was it feeding you in some other way than long distance running did? Because hiking is a very particular type of sport or pastime, and I know for many of us it just does something to our mindset and to our heads. What about you? Was it something that you were getting more out of it or were you just enjoying the physical preparation?
I think for me it's the whole process, and it's not just the physical preparation. I absolutely love, the preparation and planning behind the computer screen just as much as I do,
right.
Analyzing maps and working out the routes. So all of that preparation, both physical and otherwise, just makes the whole process of actually doing the trail much more enjoyable, because I know it's all that time and effort paying off, and I'm reaping the rewards of the research, because I found certain areas for exploration and camping, and it for me it just makes the whole process and experience much more fulfilling.
So after the PCT was put on hold, let's say, for the time being, you started doing other hikes in the UK. You did the South Downs Way, the Southwest Coast Path, which is the one that, let's say, I'd really love to do. You did it in 26 days and then 21 days. I'm expected to do it in more than those together, but we'll come to that another time. You did the West Island Way, the Cape Wrath Trail, and then the Pembrokeshire Coast and the Pennine Way.
Yes.
But then, in June 2021, you had a bit of a spanner put in the works of preparation for a long distance hike, didn't you?
I did.
You met somebody. Tell us about that.
I did. So I think with 2020 causing a lot of disruption and delaying my plans for the PCT, I then went through the whole cycle again of attempting to do the PCT in 21, and the restrictions were still in place, and that didn't allow me to do the PCT that year. And then later in the summer, I met my partner Claire, which in itself is quite a nice story, because it turns out that we both grew up in the same town for most of our lives, and there are two high schools in our hometown, and we each went to a different high school. So we didn't really know each other at the time.
Right.
And then Claire spent 2 years living in Buenos Aires and then 2 years living in Boston, and she came back in November 2020 after spending many months through the pandemic living in isolation, and I think that triggered her to realize that it was time to come home, and because of that we managed to meet. We lived 5 minutes apart, so she's travelled around the world, done lots of amazing things, and comes back home to live with her parents for the short term, and then we meet.
Yeah. So that obviously changed the equation for you. Did you put on hold? Well, you did put on hold, and it's kind of indefinitely delayed the idea of doing the PCT. Because when we spoke before, you said that you chose Claire over the PCT, which is a pretty strong statement, by the way, which is impressive. Was it tough to let go of that dream? I mean, I'm sure Claire's worth any number of PCTs, but was that still in your mind that it was something you still like to do?
So yes, certainly, because I think it was still a very present idea and a plan in my head when we were together in those sort of early months.
Sure.
And it was playing on my mind a little bit, but I knew I'd found someone incredibly special, and so when 22 came around, and suddenly the restrictions were easing, and it was seeming like a possibility to actually do the PCT after so many years. But at the time, I just felt this wasn't the right time. I had lots.
Didn't some of your friends go?
Yes, I had a couple
of friends.
A couple of friends who I'd sort of spent the past few years spending every living moment discussing the PCT and expressing how incredible it would be. So then seeing them go to the States and complete it was obviously amazing for them, and amazing for me to witness. But it was difficult. But
because the idea of a long hike hadn't quite gone away at it. And
No.
so what was the thought process that led you to this year's epic adventure, which is what we're going to talk about now?
Yeah.
Tell us, what were you looking to do?
Well, I knew that I couldn't keep going through this cycle year after year of trying to do the PCT, because I knew that essentially it was going to be very disruptive to both our lives together. And whilst I have no doubt it would have been possible and it would have been a pleasurable experience for both of us, I just felt that it would have just been slightly too disruptive in those early stages. So I knew that I couldn't keep going through this cycle, and we're very excited to plan our life together and get things moving. So I wanted to essentially break down essentially what it was about the PCT that I found so enchanting. And for me, it was the personal endeavor, the physical challenge, doing something longer, faster, more adventurous, more dangerous than I'd done before. And of course, the PCT, as everyone knows, it's stunningly beautiful. But I realized, I had realized over the few years of through hiking in the UK that there are some beautiful, beautiful trails in the UK, definitely. And it's just phenomenally beautiful. And then the idea popped into my head, well, rather than hiking the length of the United States, why don't I hike the length of the United Kingdom?
Which, by the way, I want to tell people this. The PCT is about 2,600 miles, something like that. From Canada,
2,650. Yeah.
Right. So from Mexico to Canada. Now, most people will think that Britain is about 400 miles, 500 miles, 600 miles, whatever it is. You hiked 2,450 miles in Britain this year as a through hike, didn't you? Was it 2,450?
That's
2,450. And I suppose all those training hikes in Britain you've done already, they allowed you to plan that long hike.
Yes.
What were the parameters you were trying to achieve for this year's hike? Was it a connected footpath? I mean, in much the same way the PCT was?
For me, it was quite simple. Really, it was really just connecting the most beautiful parts of Great Britain, and really just exploring it in one continuous through hike. I mean, there is a classic route that goes from one end to the other, and that's about 1,200 miles. So, with my 2,450 mile routes, I've more than doubled it.
Which is just amazing, yeah.
I think if you were to look at the route on a map, there is not much going south at all.
Right, exactly.
Obviously, the general trajectory is in a southwesterly direction, but there's a lot of zigzagging going on. Yeah,
let's explain that, because there's the two famous spots in the UK from the point of going from one end to the other. Traditionally, that was Land's End to John O'Groats, or John O'Groats to Land's End. So tell everybody where John O'Groats is and where Land's End is.
Okay, yeah. So John O'Groats is the most northeasterly place in mainland Great Britain. And Land's End is the most southwesterly point in Great Britain.
And they're the two spots, aren't they?
Yes.
And I meant to ask you, by the way, how were you able to not only do all those preparation hikes, but also the big hike this year? Didn't work get in the way?
It did a little bit.
You think?
Yeah.
I know you go fast, man, but you're taking a lot of time off.
Yes. Well, thankfully because the UK and Great Britain isn't to the same scale as the United States, for example, there are lots of shorter trails. And the majority of the trails that I had completed prior to doing my long hike this year were achievable within a few days, 1 week, 2 weeks. So taking time off work was no problem at all. But then with the likes of, so in summer 2020, I did, as you mentioned previously, the South Downs Way, the South West Coast Path, the West Highland Way, and the Cape Wrath Trail. I was able to do the South Downs Way and the South West Coast Path over the summer because the system that the government had implemented allowed furlough to be paid to employees. So salaries were subsidised by the government. whilst everything was shut down. So that gifted me some time over the summer to do those 2 trails. And then I was unfortunately made redundant along with 2 other architects at my practice at the very end of the summer when that scheme started to close, and companies and work wasn't really picking up as much as it could have done. So then I simply took the opportunity whilst I was in between jobs to go and hike the length of the West Highlands of Scotland and do the West Highland Way and the Cape Wrath Trail. So that was the opportunity that I did for those 4 hikes. And then with this current hike, with it being 2,450 miles, I calculated that to be approximately 3 months. Which obviously isn't really achievable.
Ambitious, by the way.
Which obviously isn't really achievable within the normal parameters of annual leave. So, Claire and I were sort of discussing our future, where we wanted to go in the next 5 years, and we were discussing the prospect of relocating, being close to family, and I sort of took that opportunity to leave my current job, go and fulfill this ambition of mine.
Crazy dream.
I've had dream. Literally 5-6 years, because it's just been eating away at me for so long.
I can tell. I kind of know the feeling myself. And you started on May the 17th this year at John O'Groats. Scotland can be notoriously wet. How was it? Was it pretty wet up there or cold up there? But May's probably not a bad time, actually, is it?
Scotland was an absolute dream. It was the best weather I could have ever hoped for. Obviously, as I said, I've been to Scotland before, done a couple of long trails up there, and it has the reputation to be unforgiving, and that's being kind. It can be very tough, very brutal, very wet.
Horizontal rain, I seem to remember several times.
Yes, and you often find that there's more water in your shoes than there is falling out the sky, because the bogs in Scotland are notorious, and it adds to the character of the trails up there. But because the weather was so good, it was for the first week, I would say it was fairly typical weather for early summer. But from the start of the Cape Wrath Trail on day 6 for the next month and a half, it was just sublime summer sunshine.
Wow!
And
how awesome!
It was absolutely amazing.
And your first route was actually an incomplete trail. It's going to be a trail at some stage. It's going to be the North Highland Way. Was that basically hacking your way across country, or was there actually a path somewhere there or not?
There was no waymarked path at all.
Right. Okay.
So as you say, it's hoping to become the North Highland Way, which, according to my routes, is just short of 160 miles. Right. And it quite cleverly just follows the coast of North Scotland, from John O'Groats to Cape Wrath, so from lighthouse to lighthouse. And
beautiful.
Yeah, so there's no way marking, hardly any footpaths. There's a lot of scrambling, a lot of following sheep tracks, which can be quite adventurous sometimes. But yeah, it having completed the trail that I've just done, that was certainly one of the most challenging sections.
Really?
And required the most research and planning.
Right.
I think I spent about 2 or 3 weeks researching it through using all different sources.
Right.
But whilst it was probably the most challenging, it was incredibly beautiful. It's the coastline in Scotland is just amazing.
Sure.
And so it was very, very quiet, very untouched.
I bet. There's not a trail there, that's why. There's a reason for that. And you actually had an injury scare in those early miles, didn't you? I think it was after Cape Wrath, wasn't it?
It was in the early stages of Cape Wrath, yeah.
Right. So what happened?
Well, if I tell this story, people will think that I didn't learn my lesson.
There you go.
I was in good shape, but you can always do more training, I suppose. But I pushed pretty hard from the beginning, because I was doing long days up in Scotland in May, early June.
You had very long days, didn't you?
Very long days, yeah. And so it wasn't getting dark until about 10:30. So nice. I was waking up at sunrise, walking all day, and finishing at sunset. which was just absolutely magical. But I was averaging 30 miles a day for the first week or so, and my body felt absolutely fine. I felt energized, I felt rested, relaxed. But then as I was finishing the first day on Cape Wrath, my knees just started to ache, and I knew something was playing up.
Sure.
But this was at the very end of the first day, so I thought, okay, this is fine. I'll pitch my tent. It's the end of the day. I'll wake up tomorrow morning and see how things are. I did that, and the pain hadn't really alleviated, and it got slightly worse. So I hiked a few extra miles, resupplied, but resupplied with the knowledge that I was going to keep going at the same pace as I had been. So yeah, I had a couple of days worth of food with me, hiking along, and then I knew that the pain wasn't really shifting. And I think this is one of the things that was different compared to all other trails, is that this was certainly a marathon, but it was a very long marathon and not a sprint. And I had to learn new skills, and I think knowing when to stop is much more important than knowing when to keep going. That's one of the things that I certainly took away from this experience. And I think something that was a common feature on this trip is that Claire, while she wasn't there with me in person, she was back home. She was there every step of the way. She was always at the end of the phone, and whatever issue I had, whatever problem I had, it was hers as well. And she just proved herself to be the absolute best teammate. So we had a conversation about my knees, and we agreed that it was best for me just to stop early on that day. So whilst it was difficult, because I'm always pushing myself to do long miles, long days, and I got up to such a good start.
A bit of a theme here, by the way, Dan.
yeah, absolutely. But I stopped at about 2:00 in the afternoon while camping.
Oh, you slacker!
I know, only a half day. But I found a beautiful lock while camped next to it for the rest of the day. But I knew I had to sort of keep moving because I only had limited supplies, and I knew if I was to go to the point where I had to recover properly, I needed more than just a wild camp spot next to a lock. I had to get to somewhere a bit more established with shops and communications. So I made a decision to get going the next day, but just take it a bit easier, sort of go down a couple of gears.
25 miles only,
which I think I did 20 miles the next day, and I think.
But did you basically walk it off though?
Pretty much, yeah.
That's nice.
I was,
we always say on the AT, you get an injury one day, the next day it doesn't hurt because something else hurts worse. Yes. we were getting all sorts of injuries. Yeah. But anyway, you headed south from Cape Wrath on the Cape Wrath Trail, then the West Highland Way, which I did last year, before kind of zigzagging your way east and then west as you travel south, before taking a sharp right turn into and around Wales. Tell us about the logistics of doing all of this. Is it because I would have thought you'd be staying at the bed and breakfast quite regularly, but you just didn't at all, did you?
No, not once.
Was this, I mean, I'm not prying on your finances, was this to save money or you just wanted that wild experience?
Completely the latter. I made the conscious decision not to sleep in a bed once on the whole trip. So the entirety of the trip was 88 days, just short of 88 days, so 87 nights. And I bar camped for 71 of those nights. I got the numbers here. 71 nights wild camping, 4 in shelters, which you call as a bothy. What's a bothy? Is that a shepherd's hut or something? Yeah, pretty much. So bothies are pretty commonplace. They're mostly in Scotland, but you do find some in Northern England and Wales. And essentially they are, as you say, they could have been shepherd's huts, mountain refuge huts. Some were even residences up until only a few decades ago. And these are very, very basic, typically stone-built shelters Some have a ground floor and a first floor, but some are just a ground floor. But
Right.
they're very, very basic. They have a hearth. They have platforms for sleeping. No running. Most of them don't have running water. No gas or electricity. Nothing. It's just a basic shelter.
That's okay. That's okay.
Yeah.
And then you had 8 nights in campsites and 4 in gardens. Did they know? Did the house owner know you were in their garden, or was this one of those particularly wild camping spots, or is somebody you knew?
Thankfully, they were people that I knew.
always good. And was there much road walking, or were you able to go from trail to trail fairly directly? In other words, have you kind of established a good long distance hike through the UK, or does it actually take in quite a bit of road walking?
I believe it's a very good route to do from end to end without doing too much road walking.
Nice.
Because the way that I planned the route was essentially linking up existing long distance footpaths. And remarkably, I think there are only 2 or 3 links between trails where there's maybe a 10, 15 mile stretch.
That's great.
And even they are mostly completely off road. They're just
Nice.
like typical trails. But
sounds great. I tell you,
Yeah.
I was fascinated when I saw the map. In fact, funnily enough, Dan has sent me this terrific map and all details of all the hikes he took, effectively the different paths and stages that he took, and he's let me make that available to you guys. So if you want it, there'll be a link in the show notes. We'll talk about that. And going the way you did, you could pretty much see all the parts of Scotland, England, Wales that you wanted to see, but you're ultimately heading for the Southwest Coast Path, which I know is one of your favourites. Is there a reason why it's one of your favourites, or was that the first long distance trail you'd actually did? I mean, quite a long distance trail.
Yes, it was the first big hike I would say that I completed. So after completing the Cotswold Way, the Ridge Way, and the South Downs Way, which are all typically about 100 miles.
Sure.
The Southwest Coast Path, it being 630, it's 6 times as long. It's much more difficult, much more strenuous. But I think...
Oh, hang on. How strenuous? I might have to rethink.
It's all worth it.
Oh, sure. Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. So you did that again. Was that as beautiful the second time around for you then?
Yes, it was.
Because this was at the end of your hike, wasn't it? This was where you were actually going to finish. So it must have been even extra special to do it. It's almost like a victory lap on it, wasn't it?
That's pretty much how I saw it, because after doing it the first time, it completely stole my heart. I love that trail so much. And there's an element of, objectively it being just a very, very good trail.
Mm-hmm.
But also there's, half my family are Cornish. So
are they? Oh,
yeah.
Right, nice.
So
right.
I've spent practically my whole life holidaying in Cornwall, and the north coast of Cornwall serves as a very prominent section of the Southwest Coast Path.
Yeah.
So it's just wonderful for me to incorporate that as part of the Southwest Coast Path.
Now, you just mentioned how it won your heart. Let's return now to Claire, who also won your heart. You'd arranged for her to meet you at the end, hadn't you? But you changed the plan. What'd you do?
I did. Well, it was always it was always our plan for Claire and I to meet up at different stages along the trail, and we did do that about halfway along. But I planned for my parents, Claire's parents, and my sisters to meet me at the end in Poole at the end of the Southwest Coast Path.
Nice.
But I managed to convince Claire to come down a day early. I managed to convince her that wild camping in a one-person tent on the side of a footpath was
impressive.
Was an enjoyable experience.
Yes.
But,
how did she react to that? How did she react to that first?
At first, she wasn't convinced. I had to work.
But bless her, she did turn up, and you stayed there. But there was another reason, wasn't there?
Yes. Yeah. So on my last night, we managed to find a wild camping spot at a place called Winspit Quarry, which is on the Jurassic Coast in Dorset. We found a really lovely wild camping spot just beneath the cliffs, beautiful sea view, crashing waves. It was all very romantic, and that's where I asked Claire to marry me.
That's very cool. That is very cool indeed. Impressive that she turned up. And what does she feel about the wild camping spot before you asked her to marry her?
As I said, she was quite resistant, but I was persistent, and in my head I thought I don't really care how much of a chore this is going to be, because it'll be all worth it in the end.
Absolutely. And then you stayed the night there, and then she went back, and you then did your last, I think, 17 miles in Nepal.
Yes.
And Claire wins many kudos for all of this, by the way. But even more was this amazing piece of artwork done for you. I'm going to include a picture of it in the show notes, but tell everybody what it was.
So, yeah, it turns out that even before I'd left for John O'Groats, Claire got in contact with a sculptor called David Main. And he is the gentleman who created the Southwest Coast Path start-finish marker
Nice.
that is currently in place in Port Harbour. And that was installed 20 years ago. I think it was a 20-year anniversary last year of that sculpture. So Claire got in touch with David at the very beginning, and she commissioned a sculpture. And this sculpture,
it's beautiful, man. I tell you, it is
beautiful.
Absolutely beautiful. And what's even more beautiful is that, as I understand it, she got the guy she sent pictures of you with your backpack on.
Yeah.
And he did a relief, of you actually hiking it, didn't he?
Yes, that's correct. So the sculpture is essentially a wooden plinth with a profile of a mountain ridgeline in this beautifully charred black timber, and it's amazingly textured and beautiful. And then on the ridgeline is I'd say a 3-inch tall metal figure, and as you say, its resemblance is quite incredible. Claire sent photos of me hiking, so the height, the posture, even the pack size, because I've got quite a small pack, and I'm secretly quite proud of.
Well, that's the other thing, by the way.
The
thing you sent me has got all your pack details as well, so people will be able to read those. You don't actually carry a great deal of stuff, but it's well thought out gear. I can see when I was reading through it. So, last question, really: is the PCT still a dream sometime in the future, or are you satisfied with this?
I'm very satisfied, yes, because I think that the whole process I went through 2 autumns ago, so after the summer of the summer of 22, when I was really just trying to work out what it was about the PCT that I love so much, and I think doing that process and choosing to do this hike, I found closure in wanting to do the PCT. Of course, if someone said to me tomorrow, no strings attached.
Do you want to do the PCT?
Do you want to do the PCT? Yes, absolutely. But I feel perfectly happy and content in my life and what I've achieved. So Claire and I are obviously engaged, and we're planning our wedding for next summer. And we've got lots of exciting things to look forward to. And I think from now on, our lives will be filled with lots of micro adventures and smaller trips. And I've got my biggest adventure challenge to come. Yeah.
There you go. You're damn right. Yeah. So look, I want to say congratulations to both you and to Claire, and congratulations to you, obviously, for finishing what's an epic walk, which I never knew really existed as a hike in the UK. And it does open all sorts of ideas in my mind as well. I've got to stop thinking about things like that. But thanks for coming on and sharing your story. I really appreciate it.
You're most welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, buddy. Take it easy, okay?
Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers. How about that? A 2,400-mile trek through Scotland, around the coast of Wales, and ending up on my target for next year, the Southwest Coast Path. I'm not sure I've got another 2,000-miler in me, but if I did, that would certainly be a contender. Let's see how I get on next year first. Now, before I forget, I'm going to be adding a link in the show notes of a really neat document that Dan sent me. It's got a lot of detail and a map of his hike, along with mileages and a gear list. I think you're going to get a kick out of it. I've also added a few pics, but would especially draw your attention to the carving that Claire commissioned for him. It is an epic memento from an epic hike. And, do you know, he may have wanted to do the PCT, but that wasn't in the cards for him. This was his own version, and to me, it sounds like he made it exactly what he wanted. Great stuff. Now, before we get on to catch up with Jessica, our remaining member of the Mighty Blue Class of 23, I wanted to remind you all that our complete series of Woods Hole Weekend videos are now available for free on my YouTube channel. The link is in the show notes, and if you'd like to learn how to thru-hike or to section hike, then our 4 presenters at that weekend, including me, have got plenty to teach you. Check them out. Now, approaching our 9th month on trail, here's Jessica.
Hello.
Hey, Jessica, how are you?
I'm doing all right. How are you, Steve?
I'm good. We're speaking to each other relatively late on Tuesday evening. Where are you right now?
I am in New Jersey.
Well done, you. Well done, you. You're not back at your parents' still, are you?
I am not. A fan of the show, another Steve, contacted you, and you passed that information on to me, and he has been very gracious in letting us stay here tonight and helping us slack pack today.
So where are you staying? Where's that?
It's, oh gosh, I wish I could remember the town. Highland Lakes, I think.
All right, near enough.
Yeah.
So what happened? He reached out to you. He reached out to me. That's right. And I passed. His name's Steve. Another Steve. So tell us how you met up.
So you had passed on that email to me, and I basically contacted him yesterday, actually, because we've gotten to the point where it was going to be a 2-hour drive in one direction for my dad to pick us up.
Wow.
And that's just a little too much. So, yeah. And I think my dad was getting a little tired because we've been getting up at 6 a.m. and getting out of the house and running through a trail and coming back to get us and all of that. So, but my dad got us. I was just thinking about this. So we, except for one night, we slack packed most of Connecticut. I slack packed the entire state of New York, and
that's amazing.
Most of New Jersey so far.
That is awesome. And obviously, well, not obviously, but I know that Mike obviously wasn't well, and I know that he was expecting to start again after Thanksgiving. Did he start after Thanksgiving?
He actually started the day before. He took one more day off after he saw the doctor and got meds, and then we did a little bit of a shorter day the day before Thanksgiving. We did take the day off on Thanksgiving. But yeah, he's back on trail and
how's he feeling?
Well.
Is he feeling okay?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say quite 100%, but he's doing well.
Yeah, and you have to get back into it as well, don't you, really? And you spend Thanksgiving with your parents, which must be nice for them, but they've now passed you on. You've now been passed down the line. And you've crossed the Hudson, I understand, and you went through the zoo.
I went through the zoo, and there was even a detour in the zoo, which totally cracked me up in some ways. There's been a lot of little detours and things, and, I walked across the bridge, and then I got into the zoo, and all of a sudden there's a construction crew, and they had the path shut down that the AT goes through. And it was kind of funny. A construction worker just happened to be walking towards me. So I asked him, how do I get around this back to the AT? And he had no idea what I was talking about.
Why would he? You lived in a different world, Jessica, for a long time now.
Yeah.
Oh,
exactly.
Dear, that's funny.
So I did find my way around, but yeah.
So you didn't get to do Bear Mountain, and there's good and bad about that, obviously. But you have to go around that. Obviously, you said that later the same day it snowed, rained, and hailed on you, and it was. But your dad was there again, wasn't he?
He sure was. It was supposed to. We knew bad weather was coming in. The weather reports I looked at said it wasn't supposed to hit that area until 4 or 5 o'clock. It started at 2. So I walked and it wasn't too bad at first. And then it got a little dicey. So I'm kind of hurrying along, trying to get done, and the sun's going down and it's getting cold, and there's no rain gear in the world that stays dry forever. So just about the time I was really kind of getting to the point where I was wet and starting to shiver, there was the truck. So yeah,
that's awesome. When you look back on this, you'll have really happy memories that your dad has been part of this journey with you, which is, I think, it's pretty awesome anyway. And you say that you saw the New York City skyline from the trail as you crossed into New Jersey, and I know it says New York and New Jersey painted on a rock, isn't it? Is that pretty much where you saw it then?
I think it was a little bit after.
Yeah,
or actually, it was before that. It was before that, coming southbound. So,
like or something. I'm thinking northbound. Yeah.
So, I think it's called Precipice Rock or something like that. You could see it. I worked in Midtown for 5.5 years, so it was
nice.
How weird to be on the Appalachian Trail and seeing Manhattan, but there it was, and then
I lived there myself. I lived there myself, and to see it was kind of awe-inspiring, to be honest with you. It's amazing how far away it is, but you can see it glimmering in the distance, especially on a decent day. And you talked about the boardwalks. Tell us about those.
Yeah, so this Potook boardwalk. The day we did that, we got there fairly early in the morning, and there had been a heavy frost, and it was pretty darn cold. But it gave this kind of glistening quality to all of the standing plants and things that were there. And of course, I'm sure most people, when they walk through, it's green and all of that. And so it just had this very
You're seeing a different
quality.
Trail. You're seeing a different trail, Jessica.
I am, very much so. These tall grasses and the cattails and things just covered in frost, and still some birds and things. But what a construction feat that that section goes on for. It's got to be more than a mile. Yeah.
Yes, it's a long way.
And I just keep thinking, like, for anybody who doesn't have the ability to walk long distances or on uneven terrain or whatever, and they want to touch the AT, like, what a place that would be for them to be able to do that.
That's a good point. You know what? That's a real good point, because it's yet another of those little sort of mini highlights you get. But you're right. It's a flat walk. It's a relatively easy walk on a decent weather. Perhaps it's getting colder for you now. But I would think on a lovely day, on a nice day, that would be a beautiful way for somebody to touch the AT, as you say. And it does go on quite a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think there's a parking spot that's pretty close to. It would have been the end of it for the way we were going. So it wouldn't be too, I don't think it would be wheelchair necessarily accessible, but, somebody that maybe just couldn't go up and down all the rocks and things, like, you'd be able to park fairly close and be able to walk out there and say you touched the Appalachian Trail. I mean, how cool would that be?
Funnily enough, talking to you every week, I keep having to remind myself, no, I don't need to remind myself that you're going southbound. I just can't see the trail that you're doing because of my memory of going northbound. It sounds bizarre, I know, because we've done the same miles, but just in a different direction. But it really throws me. And you got into New Jersey and you went to the monument, High Point State Park. You're pushing on now. I mean, how far actually are you now?
So we have about 290 miles to go.
Wow.
Not tomorrow, but the next day we should be crossing Delaware Water Gap.
Wow. And then you're going to hit the rocks.
The rocks. Which,
enjoy.
People keep talking about it, and the trail the last couple of days has been fairly rocky. So the part of me is like trying to mentally prepare myself, because I think it might have been Steve that we're staying with said something about, it's rocky, but these rocks are rounded, and I'm like, oh, okay.
But funny enough, I always remember people saying, when you get out of get to Delaware Water Gap, you think all the rocks are over. They don't just suddenly stop. It's very rocky for the rest of the way. You've had rocks all the way from Katahdin, so I wouldn't worry about that. But what Steve said is right. They're rounded now. They get pretty sharp. So I hope your boots are in decent shape, or your shoes are in decent shape, because you're really going to need them. And you say it's been very cold and windy in the last couple of days. Is the forecast now set pretty dire, or what?
Well, today and tomorrow, it wasn't supposed to get above freezing. And today, the wind was pretty intense. I basically had all of my layers on, and I put my rain jacket on today just to try and block some of the wind. And you've heard multiple times about how I run cold. So even moving, I was kind of having a hard time keeping my hands warm today at various points. Tomorrow, again, it's not supposed to get above freezing really. And we're up on the trail is up kind of on a ridge line too.
Sure.
It's going to be a little colder than the in-town predicted temperature, I'm sure. I mean, our water bottles were starting to freeze up at the end of the day today. So we're super grateful to be sleeping inside tonight and tomorrow night.
You are. Oh, and tomorrow night as well. So what's the plan?
Yeah. Steve is going to slack pack us tomorrow again. So we have one more day of slack packing, and then next morning we're walking out with full packs and figuring it out.
You know what, Jessica, and I know you are very grateful, but for some of our listeners have really stepped up for you in a way that must have touched your heart a lot. The fact that people want to help and want to get you on your way, because, you've been out there, 7 months now, 7.5 months, maybe a bit longer than that.
9.
Almost 9. Almost 9 months. And still got some miles to do. But, you're still at it, girl. I mean, man, it's amazing to me. You're still pushing on and still getting there to the end. And I'm just so pleased that you are. Are you, how's the hiking itself though? Is that still, you working pretty well with the hike?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. I think physically the biggest thing I'm having challenges with at this point is just exhaustion. Trying to stay warm, and we're trying to push the miles because you have to at this point. It's even slack packing. Again, obviously I'm super grateful for what both my parents were able to do for us. My mom was, cooking for us when we got home at night and figuring out dinner, and one less thing we had to figure out. But, it's been a long time, and it's definitely taking its toll. I'm still kind of managing the Achilles problem I've been having, and needless to say that slack packing has been helping with that. But, we're going to go full pack soon.
Well, you'll be pleased to know I've got somebody else who's given me their details for you to contact as well. I'm not going to tell you over the phone, but I will send it to you probably tomorrow actually, or maybe in a minute. But yeah, I think people want to see you because you've stuck it out. You're still there, so it's terrific that you're still moving on. But look, stay warm. When you do get out there, you've got that lovely warm sleeping bag, haven't you? So you should at least be warm in there at night. So are you staying in shelters? You haven't done it for a while, I suppose, but when you get back, are you going to be staying in shelters, or are you going to be staying in your tent?
Probably shelters. I mean, we're at the end of the day, it's probably going to start to get challenging to get tent stakes in the ground at this point.
Yeah.
And it's just easier to not have to put with the tent.
There were times when there was no one else in the shelter once. I set my tent up a couple of times in the shelter.
Yeah, this time
there's something kind of nice about that. Let's face it, it's cold enough. There won't be any mice around, so you should be okay in the shelters. So I think it'd be quite nice to be in the shelters generally. So let's keep going with that. Okay, but look. I'm glad you're still going. I'm glad Mike's back on it as well, because I think that would have been difficult if he hadn't been able to continue. So I'm glad he's carrying on. And we'll catch up again next week, okay?
All right.
All right then. Cheers then. Bye, Jessica.
Bye.
You've got to hand it to her. She's still pushing through, and plenty of you have reached out to me to offer Jessica help along the way. I'm very confident she's going to make it now, so if you'd like to offer a hand along the way, let me know and I'll put you in touch with her. Thanks, as ever, goes to our awesome donors. This week, I'd like to thank monthly donors Jessica Diaz, Bruce Brinker, Gregory Gertner, Hugh Ickreth, Melanie Swisher, Justin Mullins, Kevin Eastman, and our friends at Small World IFT. And you will never guess, but I got an email from Small World IFT yesterday. Turns out that she's Colleen Crescenti, and she laughs when I say that name. And Small World is not only a business, but a trail name. She even mused about turning the podcast into a TV format, which is her business. I'm up for it, Colleen. Get your people to call my people. Thanks for letting me know you are, and thanks to all our donors. You know how much you mean to me. Finally today, George Stefanos is also coming to the end of his hike, but 40 years ago. And today, well, that first tantalising glimpse of Katahdin happens at long last. I'll see you next week. Wednesday the 28th September 1983, mile 2068.1. It was a raw, bitter night, once again ending a string of warm nights after one in a row. I couldn't get myself out of the sleeping bag this morning. It was 7 o'clock when I finally dragged my lazy butt out. By the time I hit the trail, it was 8:30. Some things never change. The climb of Chairback was easy, and a long cliff walk around the summit had the best views of the entire range. Conditions were perfect. Apparently, a dry cold front moved through last night and pushed the warm, hazy air out to sea. It was a crystal clear, blue sky day. Nevertheless, I could not pick out Katahdin from Chairback. The great mass of the Whitecap Range blocked most views in that direction, but a few peaks rose above the surrounding foothills. One of them must have been Katahdin, but it was not apparent to me which one. I'd been chasing one faded dream for 2,000 miles, and it still was just a dream. Did it even exist? Maybe the whole thing was just an elaborate joke. After a short but very steep drop over those loose chunks of blasted shale down the sheer cliff face which gives Chairback Mountain its name, came an easy, more gradual descent to East Chairback Pond. I spent a lot of time taking pictures on the mountain's summit and along some open ledges near the edge of a plateau below the cliffs. Autumn colours were finally beginning to break out in earnest. Everything about my hike seems to be timed perfectly lately. I took the side trail, such as it was, to East Chairback Pond. The path had not yet been cut or cleared, but the future route had been plotted out and marked with ribbons tied around tree trunks. It was a steep descent and virtually a bushwhack, but the difficult access enhanced the pond's heady aura of isolation. As the journey's end draws near, I'm filled with a growing compulsion not to miss a thing. My own personal strain of Maine disease, I guess. I can live with it. My side trips in Maine always turn out to be worth the extra time and effort. At the bottom of the long descent from Chairback Range was the second biggest waterford on the Appalachian Trail, the west branch of the Pleasant River. 25 yards across and barely knee-deep, it was no real challenge to a backpacker who had so recently waded the Kennebec. Nevertheless, a refreshing wade through icy waters always gets me humming the theme song from the Magnificent Seven. Dun, 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 dun. On the far side of the river, the Appalachian Trail followed an old logging track called the West Branch Road through and beyond the Hermitage, a stately grove of soaring white pines with massive trunks surrounding a small clearing with bits of an old cabin's foundation. About 1.25 miles past the river, the AT turned off the road, which continued ahead as the start of the Gulf Haggis Trail. I was running late again, for all the same reasons as yesterday, but I could not pass up the Grand Canyon of Maine. I followed the side trail across Gulf Haggis Brook and followed the stream down towards the Gulf. Along the way I passed Screw Falls, where the wide stream created futuristic rock sculptures as it carved a deep canyon through the dark grey slate. 2 20-foot-high waterfalls connected by smaller cascades flowed into huge rock bowls, forming deep pools with water so clear I could pick out individual rocks along the bottoms. A cedar and hemlock forest grew right up to the rim of the canyon, while grasses, ferns, moss and small trees grew like lush oases in thin layers of duff collected in crevices and on the tiny ledges along the rock walls. The walls of this impressive miniature gulf rose more than 60 feet above the narrow channel in spots. The canyon soon faded into a milder series of smaller cascades, flumes, mini falls and shallow pools as the ground levelled and the brook continued onward through a shallow rocky channel. I took a 1.5 mile round trip to Hammond Street Pitch, a high cliff overlooking the deepest portion of the chasm. The west branch of the Pleasant River roared over cascades and flowed through pools 100 feet straight below. The opposing cliffs were even higher, massive dark grey walls of broken slate with pine and hardwoods clinging to tenuous footholds along their face. Although heavily forested and smaller in scope than the more spectacular canyons out west, Gulf Haggis was impressive. Like so many other thru-hikers, I made a vow to return someday and explore the remainder of the place. It was 1:30, and I had not exactly been burning up the trail thus far. The next shelter was 10 miles away. I really wanted to stay there tonight. The lady from Boston at Chairback Gap lean-to last night had told me that the location was beautiful and the structure less than 2 weeks old. The one small obstacle between me and some exceptional trail accommodations was the entire Whitecap Range. I needed to do some serious stepping to get there by dark. I hiked 8 miles, climbing 3 mountains before stopping for my next rest break. When this trip is over, it is going to be tough to look back and select its finest hour, but this stretch of hiking will certainly be a finalist. It sometimes seems as if I'm trying to make up for a lifetime of quitting in 5 months, which I suppose I am, come to think of it. The initial ascent of the Whitecap Range was gradual. The Appalachian Trail passed through a varied and interesting forest of hardwoods and conifers, mostly on old, abandoned tote roads. I made excellent time along this stretch. After 3.5 miles, the AT crossed a stream known as Gulf Haggis Brook, wound through a bog, and leapt straight up Gulf Haggis Mountain on a very steep, rocky path. The time I had made up in the lower portion of the climb drifted away like flotsam on the tide. The summit of Gulf Haggis Mountain was partially open. The ridge crest appeared to have been either burned over or clear-cut in the not-too-distant past. Covered with a low, dense tangle of scrubby growth, it sported some decent views back to the south. I paused very briefly at the summit to take it all in before turning northward and starting down the other side. Suddenly, I was frozen in my tracks. I had been zoning out at the time, moving ahead on autopilot. My mind was wandering distant pathways, tuning out a snowballing mass of fatigue. I had no idea why my feet had abruptly stopped, why the hair on my arms, legs and neck was spiking like the quills of a porcupine. I returned to the present, blinking like a man waking from a dream. Then I saw it. Ahead of me, and to the left, was a vision drawn from the mists of dreams, a legend of long-ago summer nights kept alive by the aspirations and longings of a tired wanderer, a myth made real by the sweat and blood of 2,000 weary miles. Yeah, that sure is some mountain. I turned to face the speaker, a steely-eyed backpacker with a grizzled beard, a Gore-Tex serape, and a little burned-out stub of a cigar in the corner of his mouth. "Then that's it?" I asked. "We made it?" "Yep," he replied. "It's been a long road. Long and hard, but it was worth it." He smiled. "By the way, you don't have to worry about the general anymore. After today, we're doing things my way. You look like you can use a rest." He turned to leave. "By the way," I said, "who are you?" He turned around. "I'm you. He pointed to the general. "So's he." He peered into my eyes. "I think you spent too much time alone in the woods." I smiled as my gaze returned to the mountain. So many miles behind me, it looked so close, it was getting late. I headed down the ridge. Beyond the summit, the crest of Gulf Haggis Mountain was a descending progression of small knobs. Viewpoints along the ridge were better than at the summit. I dropped into a grassy gap between Gulf Haggis Mountain and West Peak. An official MATC campsite was there, but it wasn't much, just a couple of mowed patches amidst the higher scrub. A spring was supposed to be 200 yards downhill, but I could find no marked trail. Even the Appalachian Trail was poorly blazed and lost in a muddle of herd paths. I lost about 10 precious minutes stumbling around trying to locate the route northward. I finally found the trail and began the long, steep climb up West Peak. An exhausted hiker topped that summit, but kept going, and the good views gave me a bit of a lift. There were even better views along the descent into the next gap. The climb up Hay Mountain was reasonable, but I was absolutely spent even as I was making it. It was the third consecutive major mountain I climbed without stopping at the tail end of a 3-day marathon. Good thing the general will not be around to talk me into any more of these. Hay Mountain was considerably wooded, but there were a few partial views near the top. I pushed on grimly, descending into the sag between Hay and Whitecap, and even managing to climb part of the steep slope on the other side. Finally, I had to sit down for 10 minutes, though the sun was setting. I had a granola bar and drank some water. Resuming the climb, I caught an intense second wind at exactly the right moment and roared up to the summit ridge of Whitecap. After that, it was simply a gradual ascent through dwarf spruce to the top, at which I arrived slightly before sunset. I was just in time to experience the deep, rich colours from a mountaintop along the Appalachian Trail for the second consecutive evening. I know I said only yesterday that I'd made my final night hike. I've been full of shit before, and imagine I will be full of shit again many times. The summit was a clutter of radio transmitters, a couple of tin sheds and the ruins of an old fire tower, but the views were amazing. I saw Katahdin one final time as I swung around the north side of the crest and started down. I went as far down the mountainside as I could before stopping to get my flashlight out of my backpack. The batteries had died, so I was treated to the adventure of locating my spares and installing them in the dark. When the job was finished, I turned on the light and the bulb blew, so I had the privilege of reliving the entire experience one more time. 10 minutes after stopping, I was finally able to continue my hike with a working flashlight. I arrived at Logan Brook Lean-To at almost 7:30. Few homes had ever been such a welcome sight. The structure is brand spanking new and in mint condition. It was built to replace the old Whitecap Lean-To, which has recently been relocated off the Appalachian Trail. Until this year, the AT did not go over Whitecap Mountain, but descended off the ridge from the sag between Whitecap and Hay. AT hikers were compelled to walk more than a mile on a side trail to reach the summit. That was one excellent relocation, and I'm glad it was completed in time for my thru-hike. The shelter is in a pretty little wooded canyon on the north slope of Whitecap Mountain. Logan Brook runs just below the shelter on the floor of the canyon, a nice sound to which to fall asleep. This is a beautiful spot, and I have it all to myself tonight. It is hard to believe I'm only 70 miles from the end of the Appalachian Trail. It is hard to believe the trail has an end after following it for such a long time, but I've seen the legendary mountain, so apparently it must be true. Thursday the 29th of September 1983, mile 2087.3. I took my time preparing to leave the shelter this morning. The place was even nicer in the daylight. I was out of my sleeping bag at 6:30, but it was 8:30 on another cool, crisp morning when I took one final look at my fifth to last home on the Appalachian Trail and started hiking the remainder of that long, steep slope down to the lowlands. The AT descended moderately along the floor of the canyon for almost a mile, then slouched to the side of the slope for a brief while before dropping sharply to the foot of the mountain and crossing a gravel logging road. A 2-mile stretch of nice, level terrain brought me to a fording of the east branch of the Pleasant River. It was nothing. My feet didn't even get wet. This was followed by a steep climb up a spur of Boardman Mountain. A viewpoint at the crest looked back over the flat river valley to Whitecap, looming 2,000 feet above me. I took a half-hour break, simply because it was a nice spot and I felt like it. I surrendered to Maine disease at every opportunity, and the day drifted pleasantly. I imagine the General would have relished slapping me. Katahdin's magnetic pull had ebbed considerably following its long-awaited first sighting yesterday. A relatively level ridge walk led to Mountain View Pond. Across the small lake, Boardman's slopes were aflame with fall colours. Water and sky were an incredible blue, while conifers and late-turning hardwoods added some nice green tones to the mix. The 5-month trek was climaxing nicely. From the pond, the Appalachian Trail climbed very gently along an old grassy tote road before leaving the road and shooting straight up the steep slope of Little Boardman Mountain. It crested the ridge at the top of some ledges with great views and then passed another ledge which had even better ones. The air was dry and clean with no haze or pollution. Little smoke-puffed clouds stood out in 3D against the deep blue sky, and individual trees were discernible on ridges miles away. Wind ripples on the surface of Mountain View Pond were deep, precise etchings on its perfect surface. Little Boardman's summit was heavily wooded, but I caught another glimpse of Katahdin through the trees. The entire trail from the east branch of the Pleasant to beyond this point was another 1983 relocation, making 2 great reloads in a row. The trail dropped off the little ridge and returned to the true lowlands, where it skirted one of the many large lakes for which this portion of Maine is famous. This one was called Crawford Pond. At one point, the AT touched shore at a tiny but perfect sand beach, perhaps 25 square yards in area, with views back across the lake to Little Boardman Mountain and several other low ridges. 5 or 6 fishermen were out on the water in small boats, quite a few people to see all at once in this remote part of Maine. After following the south shore of Crawford Pond for about a mile, the Appalachian Trail trod old abandoned tote roads along the course of Cooper Brook for 8 miles, usually out of sight of the stream. The forest was rather attractive, but this stretch was rather dull compared to the preceding trail, and I made my best time of the day along it. I passed Cooper Brook lean-to, which sat beside an attractive cascade and brushed against the shores of several ponds. When the 80 finally swung away from the brook for the last time, it crossed several outlets of a large marshy lake called Mud Pond. Some of the fords were a little tricky. Eventually, I ascended a low ridge overlooking the pond. It was much prettier than its name implied. There was no third consecutive night hike at the end of this day, but I did not miss it by much. At 6:20, the Appalachian Trail passed a small peninsula thrust into an enormous expanse of water. Along the eastern edge, a string of about a dozen ageing wooden cabins slumbered beneath the giant pines of even greater antiquity along a gravel shore. When I took breakfast at Carrying Place Camps near Pierce Pond on the morning I would ford the Kennebec, I mentioned they were the first 3 sets of old hunting camps still on the AT. This was the second, Old Antlers Camps on Lower Joe Mary Lake. Unlike Carrying Place, these cabins were long ago abandoned to the forest. Most were ruined shells, gradually crumbling through slow years of neglect. However, 2 were still habitable. Near the point of the peninsula, cabins number 1 and number 3 had been rescued from decay. 2 men were set up in one when I arrived, but number 3 was empty. That is my new home for tonight. This was the second of 2 stops which came highly recommended by the lady from Boston I met 2 nights ago. She was especially enthusiastic about this one. She and her husband found an indescribable quality here which drew them in and captured their hearts. I could not exactly see the attraction at first. There were no luxury accommodations. My cabin was dusty and dilapidated. A lumpy, naked mattress on a ramshackle bunk gave off a slight but distinct musty aroma. The place gradually won me over. A timeless quality resides here, an aura of having stepped into the past. From an old wooden chair on my screened front porch, I watched loons drifting upon quiet waters, fading into a deepening twilight. When the darkness fell like a theatrical curtain ending the show, I lit a candle on an old table inside and began this entry. Usually I must write sprawled out on the hardwood floor of a shelter or the plastic floor of my tent. This is better. I have 3 quarts of drinking water from a spring I passed 3 miles back, and plenty of lake water right outside for cooking. I have a comfortable berth upon which to lay down my sleeping bag. I have a rustic old cabin from a vanishing era in time. I have a vision of beauty waiting for me just outside my window when morning breaks over miles of gently lapping waters stretching eastward from the point. I also have but 51.2 miles of remaining trail.